At exactly 2:13 every morning, the boy in room 511 moved his fingers when the cleaning lady played piano music. The doctors called it a reflex. The nurses called it impossible. But for 2 years behind a locked hospital door nobody was allowed to enter. A forgotten child kept responding to the voice of a woman the world barely noticed. And the terrifying part wasn't that the boy was alive. It was that some people inside that hospital wished he wasn't. St. Gabriel Medical Center stood in the richest part of downtown Chicago, where polished marble floors reflected chandelier light and luxury sedans lined the private entrance every night. The hospital looked more like a 5-star hotel than a place where people came to suffer. Wealthy families paid thousands of dollars a day for silence, privacy, and doors that stayed closed. Margaret Collins arrived every evening at 10:45 sharp carrying a faded blue lunch bag and wearing white sneakers that had begun to crack around the soles. At 46 years old, her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors, carrying groceries, and working double shifts that left her exhausted long before sunrise. Most people inside the hospital barely looked at her. She was simply part of the background, another invisible worker pushing a janitor's cart through quiet hallways, while wealthy patients slept behind expensive doors. But Margaret noticed everything. She noticed the nervous doctors whispering near elevators. She noticed security guards stationed outside rooms that didn't officially exist on hospital maps. And most of all, she noticed the locked hallway on the 5th floor. The hallway had no sign, no directory, and no patients listed in the computer system. Employees called it the private wing, but rumors spread constantly during overnight shifts. Some nurses claimed a senator recovered there after a stroke. Others believed a famous actor secretly received treatment inside those rooms. But Margaret knew there was only one patient at the end of that hallway. She had seen his name once on a medical chart accidentally left near the nurse's station. Ethan Blackwood. Even the name sounded expensive. Around midnight, Margaret pushed her cleaning cart through the silent 5th-floor corridor. Soft yellow lights glowed against cream-colored walls while security cameras followed every movement. Room 511 sat at the very end of the hall behind thick wooden doors with a small glass window. 2 guards normally stood nearby during the day, but overnight only cameras remained. Margaret slowed as she passed the room like she always did. Through the narrow glass panel, she could barely see the outline of a teenage boy lying motionless beneath white blankets. Machines blinked quietly beside him. Tubes disappeared beneath sheets. The room looked cold despite its luxury. No flowers sat near the window. No family photos decorated the walls. No balloons. No signs anyone loved the boy inside. Margaret stopped pushing her cart. For reasons she didn't fully understand, she always felt sad near room 511. Maybe because the boy looked so young. Maybe because nobody ever visited him. Or maybe because loneliness was something she recognized instantly. She pulled a small Bluetooth speaker from her cart and placed it near the hallway wall. Quiet piano music drifted softly through the corridor. Margaret resumed mopping the floor while the melody echoed gently beneath dim lights. Then it happened again. Through the tiny window, Ethan's fingers twitched slightly against the blanket. Margaret froze. The first time she noticed it 3 weeks earlier, she convinced herself she imagined it. But now she saw it clearly. A small movement. Brief but real. Her heartbeat quickened. She stepped closer to the glass. Ethan remained motionless otherwise, his pale face still and peaceful beneath the soft hospital lighting. Margaret stared for several seconds before whispering quietly, "Good evening, sweetheart." She felt ridiculous saying it out loud. The boy had been unconscious for nearly 2 years according to hospital gossip. Doctors claimed he couldn't hear anything. Still, Margaret found herself speaking to him every night. Sometimes she talked about the weather. Sometimes about her mother back in Milwaukee struggling with heart problems. Sometimes about nothing important at all. It simply felt wrong for someone so young to lie in silence forever. A sudden voice startled her. "You shouldn't stand there too long." Margaret turned quickly. A young nurse with tired eyes stood near the station holding a clipboard. Her badge read Olivia Carter. Margaret gave an embarrassed smile. "Sorry. I was just cleaning." Olivia glanced toward the room before lowering her voice. "Most people avoid this hallway." "Why?" Margaret asked softly. The nurse hesitated. Then she leaned closer. "Because that boy is worth more dead than alive." Margaret felt cold all at once. Before she could ask another question, Olivia walked away down the corridor, leaving only the distant sound of piano music and the silent boy behind the closed door. For the next several nights, Margaret Collins found herself slowing down every time she reached the 5th floor. She told herself it was because the private wing required extra cleaning, because the marble floors showed footprints more easily beneath soft lighting, because wealthy patients complained about everything. But deep down she knew the truth. She kept returning to room 511 because of the boy behind the locked door. Snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago outside the hospital windows, while midnight settled over St. Gabriel Medical Center. The 5th floor remained unusually quiet as always, separated from the rest of the hospital by security doors and silent hallways that smelled faintly of expensive flowers and disinfectant. Margaret pushed her cleaning cart carefully past darkened rooms until she reached the final door at the end of the corridor. Ethan Blackwood lay motionless beneath pale blue light, the steady rhythm of machines filling the silence around him. Margaret paused beside the glass window for several seconds before quietly stepping inside. Technically, she was only supposed to clean the floors and empty trash bins. Technically, she was not supposed to stay longer than necessary. But after nearly 2 years in that room, Ethan no longer felt like just another patient to her. He felt forgotten. Margaret adjusted the blanket near his shoulder gently after noticing it had slipped slightly downward. "You know," she whispered softly, "my mother would lose her mind if she saw a blanket folded this poorly." Ethan remained still beneath the white sheets while snow reflected faintly against the massive windows overlooking the city skyline. Margaret picked up a half-empty water pitcher from the bedside table and replaced it with fresh ice water even though no one had asked her to. Then she opened the curtains slightly. "A little sunlight tomorrow morning might help," she murmured. "Rooms feel sad when nobody opens the blinds." She pulled the small Bluetooth speaker from her cart again and let quiet piano music drift softly through the room. Over the past week she had started noticing small reactions whenever music played near Ethan. Tiny movements. Slight changes in his breathing. Nothing dramatic enough for doctors to celebrate, but enough for Margaret to feel certain something inside him was still listening. She sat briefly in the chair beside his bed while waiting for the floor polish to dry near the hallway entrance. "Today was awful," she admitted quietly. "The bus broke down in freezing weather and I stepped into slush up to my ankle." A tired smile crossed her face. "You are lucky you get to stay warm in here." She laughed softly at herself afterward. Talking to an unconscious billionaire teenager at 2 in the morning probably sounded ridiculous. But somehow the room felt less empty when she spoke aloud. Margaret reached into her lunch bag and pulled out the paperback novel she had been reading during breaks. "I used to read to my son when he was little," she said carefully before pausing. A shadow crossed her face briefly. Before. She stopped herself there. Margaret rarely talked about her past. Not anymore. Some grief settled into a person quietly over the years until speaking about it felt heavier than silence itself. Instead, she opened the book and began reading softly beside Ethan's bed, while piano music played quietly in the background. Nearly 20 minutes passed that way. Snow falling outside. Machines humming steadily. Margaret reading in a calm, tired voice that sounded more maternal than she realized. Then suddenly Ethan's fingers twitched again. Margaret stopped reading instantly. This time the movement lasted longer than before. Not random. Not accidental. His hand shifted weakly against the blanket as though trying to respond to the sound of her voice. Margaret slowly lowered the book into her lap. "Ethan," she whispered. The room remained still except for the faint increase on the heart monitor beside him. Margaret stared at the machine carefully. His heart rate had risen slightly since she started reading aloud. Her pulse quickened. Before she could move closer, the door opened quietly behind her. Olivia Carter stepped inside carrying patient charts. She stopped immediately after seeing Margaret seated beside Ethan. For a second neither woman spoke. Then Olivia looked toward the monitor and froze. "Wait," she whispered. "His numbers were lower 20 minutes ago." Margaret looked nervous instantly. "I was just reading." Olivia stepped slowly closer to the bed, studying Ethan's hand resting against the sheets. "Do that again." "What?" "Read." Margaret hesitated before picking up the book again with trembling fingers. She continued the story softly from where she left off. As her voice filled the room once more, Ethan's breathing changed slightly beneath the blankets. Olivia stared at the monitor in disbelief while neurological readings climbed gradually upward. "Oh my God," she whispered. Margaret looked frightened now. "Is something wrong?" Olivia turned toward her slowly. No, her voice dropped lower. "Something is waking up." Olivia Carter did not speak again until she and Margaret stepped outside room 511 nearly 20 minutes later. The young nurse closed the door carefully behind them while glancing down the empty hallway to make certain nobody else was nearby. Snow continued falling beyond the tall hospital windows, covering downtown Chicago in silence beneath the pale glow of streetlights. "What exactly have you been doing in there every night?" Olivia asked quietly. Margaret looked confused by the question. "Nothing unusual. I clean. Sometimes I talk to him." "You read to him?" "Only because the room feels lonely." Olivia folded her arms tightly against the cold air drifting through the corridor vents. "His neurological activity has barely changed in almost 2 years. Tonight his readings jumped higher than I have ever seen." Margaret stared through the small glass window at Ethan lying motionless beneath soft blue light. Maybe it was coincidence. Olivia shook her head slowly. Doctors do not believe in coincidences when machines start showing patterns. The nurse looked genuinely unsettled now. "I need to show you something." She led Margaret quietly toward the nurse's station and opened Ethan's medical chart on a secure tablet screen. Margaret barely understood most of the terminology, but even she could see the highlighted graphs climbing upward during specific time periods. Olivia pointed carefully. "These spikes started about 6 weeks ago." Margaret frowned slightly. "That is when I started covering overnight shifts on this floor." "Exactly." Olivia lowered her voice further. "Every increase happens during your shifts, usually when you are inside his room." Margaret felt uneasy all over again. "That does not make sense." "No," Olivia whispered. "It does not." Before Margaret could respond, elevator doors opened at the far end of the hallway. Several men in expensive dark coats stepped onto the 5th floor, followed by security personnel carrying briefcases and tablets. Even from a distance, their presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Nurses straightened their posture. Conversations stopped. Margaret recognized Richard Blackwood at once from television interviews. Tall despite his age, silver-haired, carrying the kind of quiet authority money built over decades. Beside him walked another man perhaps 20 years younger, sharply dressed with controlled confidence behind every movement. Daniel Blackwood, Ethan's uncle. Olivia immediately lowered the tablet screen. "You should go back to cleaning," she whispered quickly. "Why?" Olivia's expression tightened. "Because the Blackwoods do not like hospital staff paying attention to family matters." The group passed down the hallway toward a private conference room near room 511. Richard looked exhausted, his face older and heavier than newspaper photographs ever showed. Daniel looked different. Calm, focused, polished. The kind of man who smiled during interviews while saying absolutely nothing personal. Margaret resumed mopping quietly near the wall while security guards closed the conference room doors behind them. 15 minutes later, voices began filtering faintly into the hallway. "The board meeting cannot be postponed again," a man argued from inside. "Shareholders want permanent leadership resolved before the next quarter." Another voice answered sharply. "Ethan is still alive." "Richard." Silence followed briefly before Daniel spoke in a measured tone. "Father, nobody is questioning that. But the company cannot remain frozen indefinitely." Margaret slowed her mopping unconsciously. "Doctors see no meaningful recovery," another voice added. "If legal control stays unresolved, investors may begin pulling support." Richard's voice hardened immediately. "My grandson is not a business obstacle." "No," Daniel replied carefully. "But Blackwood Holdings employs nearly 40,000 people. If leadership collapses, thousands of families suffer." Margaret paused slightly. That did not sound cruel. It sounded tired, stressed, like a man trying to hold together something already cracking beneath pressure. "Daniel may be right," another executive admitted quietly. "The uncertainty is hurting the company." Richard exhaled heavily. "You are discussing Ethan like he is already gone." Daniel answered after several seconds of silence. I am discussing reality. Margaret looked instinctively toward room 511 at the end of the hallway. Ethan remained motionless behind the glass while wealthy men debated his future only yards away. Suddenly the conference room door opened. Margaret immediately lowered her eyes and continued scrubbing the marble floor beside the wall. Daniel Blackwood stepped into the hallway first while adjusting his cufflinks. Up close he looked even more composed than he had on television. Expensive charcoal suit. Perfect posture. Calm expression hiding exhaustion beneath it. He noticed Margaret instantly. Late shift, he said politely while passing. Yes, sir. Daniel glanced briefly toward Ethan's room before looking back at her. You work this floor often? Most nights recently. Then you probably know the importance of privacy around here. His tone remained smooth and professional, but something underneath it felt like a warning wrapped carefully inside courtesy. Margaret nodded quietly. I just do my job, sir. Daniel studied her face for a moment longer before giving a faint smile. Good. Hospitals function better when people focus only on what concerns them. He walked away toward the elevators while lawyers followed behind him carrying stacks of documents. Margaret watched silently until the doors closed. Then she looked back toward room 511 again. Through the narrow glass window she could see Ethan lying alone beneath dim blue light while an entire empire argued quietly behind closed doors about whether he would ever wake up. 3 nights later, freezing rain hammered against the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center, while most of Chicago slept beneath icy streets and blurred traffic lights. Margaret Collins arrived for her overnight shift exhausted before she even clocked in. Her second job at a grocery store warehouse had extended 2 extra hours because of delayed deliveries, leaving her shoulders aching and her hands raw from lifting heavy boxes all evening. She changed into her janitor uniform slowly inside the employee locker room, while staring at the small balance left in her bank account on her phone screen. $187. Rent was due next week. Her mother's heart medication refill was overdue again. And now her car had started making a grinding noise every time she touched the brakes. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. One problem at a time, she whispered to herself. But lately it felt like life had stopped waiting its turn. By midnight she reached the 5th floor carrying fresh linens and cleaning supplies. The hallway remained quiet except for soft piano music drifting from her speaker near room 511. Over the past several nights, Dr. Benjamin Hayes had quietly stopped objecting whenever Margaret stayed inside Ethan's room longer than necessary. In fact, after reviewing Ethan's neurological responses personally, the doctor had begun encouraging it. He never said so directly, in front of other staff, but Margaret understood the truth. Ethan reacted to her presence in ways expensive treatments never managed to achieve. She stepped inside the room softly and noticed Ethan's curtains were closed again. Who keeps shutting these every day? She muttered while pulling them open slightly. The Chicago skyline glowed silver beneath rain and distant headlights. Margaret adjusted Ethan's blanket before sitting carefully in the chair beside him. Well, she sighed quietly, today was a disaster. She rubbed her tired forehead with one hand. You ever have one of those days where everything feels heavier than it should? Ethan remained motionless beneath the dim blue lighting while machines hummed steadily beside the bed. Margaret opened the novel she had been reading to him throughout the week but stopped before starting the next chapter. Her eyes drifted toward the window instead. I almost quit my warehouse job tonight, she admitted softly. My supervisor yelled at me because I dropped a crate of canned soup. A weak laugh escaped her. 46 years old and still getting treated like a teenager making minimum wage. She looked down at her hands quietly. I know people probably think I am strong. But honestly, I am tired. The room stayed silent except for the rain tapping gently against the glass. Margaret swallowed hard before continuing. My mother keeps pretending she is fine because she knows I cannot afford more hospital bills. I keep pretending I am fine because she worries too much already. Her voice softened further. Sometimes I do not know how much longer I can carry everybody. Tears filled her eyes unexpectedly. Embarrassed, she quickly looked away and wiped them before they could fall. Sorry, she whispered to Ethan. You probably do not need somebody dumping their problems on you. She stood abruptly from the chair and walked toward the sink near the back wall, pretending to organize supplies while trying to calm herself down. For the first time since she began working the 5th floor, Margaret genuinely considered asking for reassignment. She cared too much now. About Ethan. About the strange connection forming inside this room. About whether he survived a family war happening quietly around him. And carrying hurt when life already felt impossible outside the hospital. Maybe I should stop coming up here, she whispered faintly to herself. Behind her, the heart monitor suddenly changed rhythm. Margaret froze instantly. Slowly she turned back toward the bed. Ethan's fingers were moving again. Not random twitching this time. His hand shifted weakly across the blanket as though searching for something. Margaret stepped closer carefully, her pulse quickening. "Ethan," she whispered. His breathing had changed too. Slightly uneven. Faster than before. Margaret reached for his hand instinctively. The moment her fingers touched his, Ethan gripped her weakly. Margaret gasped softly. The pressure was fragile, but unmistakably intentional. Tears rushed instantly into her eyes again. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered shakily. "You heard me." The room monitor continued rising steadily, while Ethan's fingers held onto hers with surprising persistence. Margaret sat beside him again quickly, still holding his hand carefully between both of hers now. "I am here," she said softly through tears. "I am not going anywhere tonight." The door opened quietly behind her moments later. Dr. Hayes stepped inside carrying a tablet but stopped immediately after seeing Ethan's monitor readings. His expression changed completely. "What happened?" Margaret looked up breathlessly. "He grabbed my hand." Dr. Hayes moved quickly beside the bed and checked the readings himself. For several tense seconds he said nothing. Then he looked directly at Margaret. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "I need you to understand how important this is." Margaret glanced down at Ethan, still holding her hand weakly. "Is he waking up?" Dr. Hayes hesitated. Outside the room, thunder rolled faintly across the Chicago skyline while rain streaked against the windows. Finally the doctor answered quietly. "I think he is trying to." By the following week, Room 511 had quietly become the center of tension inside St. Gabriel Medical Center. Not publicly. Not officially. The 5th floor still looked calm to visitors passing through polished hallways beneath expensive artwork and soft lighting. Nurses still moved professionally between patient rooms. Security guards still stood near elevators pretending not to listen to conversations around them. But beneath the surface everything had changed. Ethan Blackwood was responding. And only a handful of people knew why. Dr. Benjamin Hayes now reviewed Ethan's neurological charts personally every morning before leaving the hospital. The patterns were undeniable. Brain activity increased during Margaret Collins's overnight shifts with consistent emotional response markers tied specifically to her voice. Olivia Carter had begun quietly adjusting schedules to keep Margaret assigned to the 5th floor as often as possible without attracting attention from administration. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood had stopped missing his nightly visits entirely. He never interrupted Margaret when she sat beside Ethan reading softly or speaking about ordinary life. Instead, he often remained outside the glass window silently watching the room for long stretches of time. On Thursday evening, Richard requested private access to hospital security footage from the previous 3 months. Margaret knew nothing about it. She arrived at work exhausted as usual, carrying a worn paperback novel and a thermos of coffee while snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago again. When she stepped into room 511, Ethan's monitor reacted within seconds now. Small increases. Subtle but immediate. "Well," Margaret smiled faintly while setting down her supplies, "you are making it impossible for me to pretend this is coincidence anymore." Ethan remained unconscious beneath pale blue lighting, but his breathing had grown less mechanical during recent nights. Sometimes his fingers moved weakly when she spoke directly to him. Twice now his eyes had shifted faintly beneath closed lids during piano music. Tiny moments, but enough to make hope dangerous. Margaret sat beside him and opened her book again. "Tonight's chapter is terrible," she warned softly. "The main character keeps making horrible decisions." She glanced toward him with tired amusement. "Kind of reminds me of most people." Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Richard Blackwood sat alone inside a private hospital office watching security recordings on a large monitor screen. Hour after hour played silently across the screen. Margaret changing flowers nobody else replaced. Margaret adjusting Ethan's blankets carefully before leaving. Margaret reading books beside his bed long after her shift technically ended. Margaret sitting beside Ethan during thunderstorms, while quietly humming old piano melodies to calm his elevated heart rate. Richard watched footage from Christmas Eve where Margaret brought a tiny battery-operated string of lights from home, because she said no young person should spend the holidays in complete darkness. Then footage from New Year's night where she sat eating vending machine cookies beside Ethan while speaking softly about fireworks exploding over Chicago. And finally footage from 3 weeks earlier. Margaret had fallen asleep accidentally beside Ethan's bed around 4 in the morning after finishing her second job before coming to the hospital. Still wearing her janitor uniform, curled awkwardly in the chair, one hand resting lightly near Ethan's blanket as snow fell outside the windows. Richard paused the footage there. The room remained silent except for the low hum of electronics. After nearly 2 minutes, he spoke quietly to himself. Why does a stranger care more about my grandson than his own family? A knock interrupted him. Daniel Blackwood entered moments later carrying legal documents beneath one arm. The board is waiting for your final recommendation, he said calmly. Richard did not look away from the paused security image. Daniel's eyes shifted toward the monitor screen. Who is that? The cleaning woman assigned to Ethan's floor. Daniel frowned faintly. Why are you watching hospital staff? Richard finally turned toward him. Because she spends more time with Ethan than anyone else in this family. Daniel placed the documents carefully onto the desk. Father, you are exhausted. You are looking for meaning in random behavior. Richard's expression hardened slightly. She talks to him. He is unconscious. And yet his condition improves during her shifts. Daniel exhaled quietly, clearly restraining frustration now. Doctors already explained that neurological fluctuations happen. Not like this. Silence settled heavily between them. Finally Daniel spoke again in a softer voice. The company cannot survive indefinitely without stable leadership. Richard looked at him carefully. Is that what this is really about? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. This is about 40,000 employees depending on Blackwood Holdings surviving the next fiscal year. And Ethan? Daniel looked away briefly before answering. Ethan deserved better than what happened to him. The answer sounded genuine. Tired. Human. But something unresolved still lingered beneath it. Richard studied his son silently for several moments before speaking again. Do not underestimate people simply because they clean floors instead of boardrooms. Daniel glanced once more toward Margaret frozen on the monitor screen beside Ethan's bed. I am not underestimating her. His voice lowered slightly. I am questioning why my nephew only responds when she is near. Upstairs, unaware of any conversation happening below her, Margaret continued reading softly beside Ethan's bed, while snow covered Chicago in silence. Then suddenly Ethan's fingers tightened around her hand stronger than ever before. Margaret Collins woke up Monday morning to the sound of her landlord pounding on her apartment door. Sunlight barely reached through the cracked blinds of her tiny South Side apartment, while freezing wind rattled the old windows. She checked the clock beside her couch and immediately sat upright in panic. 11:37 in the morning. She had overslept by nearly 4 hours after working 2 jobs through the weekend. Mrs. Collins, the landlord shouted again through the door. Rent was due 3 days ago. Margaret rubbed exhaustion from her eyes before standing quickly. Every muscle in her body ached. She had fallen asleep still wearing sweatpants beside a stack of unpaid utility bills spread across her coffee table. I know, she answered softly through the door. I just need a little more time. Silence followed briefly before the landlord sighed heavily. You always say that. Footsteps disappeared down the hallway moments later. Margaret leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt something dangerous creeping into her thoughts. Defeat. She drove to the grocery warehouse that afternoon beneath gray skies and freezing rain. Her supervisor complained about delayed shipments before she even clocked in. A younger employee laughed when Margaret accidentally dropped a box of canned vegetables because her hands shook from exhaustion. By 6 o'clock, her lower back burned so badly she struggled lifting inventory onto metal carts. During break she checked her phone and saw 2 missed calls from St. Gabriel Medical Center. One from Olivia. One from Dr. Hayes. Margaret stared at the screen for several seconds without answering. Then slowly she turned the phone face down on the table. She could not carry everybody anymore. Not Ethan. Not her mother. Not Bill's. Not endless overnight shifts. Somewhere along the way she had stopped existing as a person and become a machine solving emergencies for everyone else. When her warehouse shift finally ended, snow had started falling heavily across Chicago again. Margaret sat inside her old sedan gripping the steering wheel, while the heater struggled against the cold air leaking through cracked vents. She looked toward the highway leading downtown, then toward the opposite road home. For nearly a full minute she sat there motionless. Maybe I should stop, she whispered to herself. The words hurt more than she expected, because part of her already knew she did not mean the hospital. She meant caring. Margaret arrived at St. Gabriel over an hour late for her overnight shift. The fifth floor felt unusually tense the moment elevator doors opened. 2 additional security guards stood near the hallway entrance, while nurses moved quickly between stations speaking in lowered voices. Olivia spotted Margaret immediately and hurried toward her. "Where have you been?" she asked anxiously. Margaret removed her wet gloves slowly. "Working." Olivia glanced around before lowering her voice. "Daniel Blackwood brought in outside neurologists tonight." Margaret's stomach tightened instantly. "Why?" "The board meets tomorrow morning." Olivia swallowed nervously. "They want updated recommendations about Ethan's long-term prognosis." Margaret looked toward room 511 at the far end of the hallway. Fear settled quietly inside her chest. "What did Dr. Hayes say?" "That Ethan is improving." Olivia hesitated briefly. The specialist disagreed. Margaret stepped silently toward the room while snow swirled beyond the tall hospital windows. Through the glass she could see Ethan lying motionless beneath dim blue lighting exactly as always. Yet something felt different tonight. Colder somehow. More fragile. She entered quietly and closed the door behind her. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered automatically while setting down her bag. "Sorry I am late." Ethan remained still. No change in the monitor. No small increase in heart rate like usual. Margaret stood frozen beside the bed. "Ethan." "Nothing." Her chest tightened painfully. For the first time since this strange connection began, fear truly overwhelmed her. What if she imagined everything? What if all the hope growing around this room suddenly disappeared tonight? Margaret sat heavily in the chair beside him and lowered her face into trembling hands. "I do not know what I am doing anymore," she whispered through tears. "Everybody keeps expecting me to save something." Her voice cracked softly. "And I cannot even save myself." The room stayed silent except for distant thunder outside the windows. Margaret looked toward Ethan again, exhausted beyond words now. "Maybe your family is right," she whispered weakly. "Maybe this is hopeless." Suddenly warmth touched her fingers. Margaret froze instantly. Slowly she looked down. Ethan's hand had moved across the blanket again, searching weakly until his fingertips brushed hers. Then, with more strength than ever before, he wrapped his fingers tightly around her hand and held on. Margaret gasped softly while tears filled her eyes again. Ethan's heart monitor immediately began rising faster across the screen. His breathing changed beneath the blankets, uneven but unmistakably responsive. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered shakily. "You heard that?" The grip tightened again weakly as though answering her. Margaret moved closer to the bed while holding his hand carefully between both of hers now. "Okay," she whispered through tears. "Okay, sweetheart. I am still here." Outside room 511, unseen behind the narrow glass window, Richard Blackwood stood silently in the hallway watching everything. Richard Blackwood remained outside room 511 long after Margaret finally fell asleep beside Ethan's bed near 4 in the morning. Snow drifted quietly across downtown Chicago, while pale hospital lights reflected against the windows around him. Inside the room, Margaret rested awkwardly in the chair, still wearing her janitor uniform, one hand loosely holding Ethan's fingers even in sleep. And for the first time in nearly 2 years, Ethan's vital signs looked calmer when someone stayed beside him. Richard stared through the glass silently. Wealth had surrounded his family for generations. Private schools, security teams, vacation homes, lawyers handling every problem before it reached public view. Yet none of it had managed to give Ethan what this exhausted woman somehow offered naturally. Presence. Humanity. The following afternoon, Daniel Blackwood sat alone inside the executive conference room overlooking the Chicago River, while shareholders argued through speakerphones across a polished mahogany table. Financial reports covered the screens surrounding him. Declining investor confidence. Delayed expansion projects. Legal uncertainty surrounding succession rights. Every chart told the same story. Blackwood Holdings could not remain suspended indefinitely, while Ethan's condition remained unresolved. "We need stability," one board member insisted through the speaker system. "Markets are already reacting to rumors about the medical review." Daniel loosened his tie slightly while rubbing tired eyes. He had slept barely 3 hours. "I understand the numbers," he answered calmly. "But my father refuses any discussion regarding succession while Ethan remains alive." Silence followed briefly before another executive spoke carefully. "Then perhaps medical recommendations need reevaluation." Daniel looked toward the snowy skyline outside the windows. People often assumed wealth removed pressure from life. In reality, it simply changed the scale of consequences. If Blackwood Holdings collapsed, nearly 40,000 employees across multiple states could lose jobs. Retirement funds would disappear. Entire manufacturing contracts would fail. Daniel carried those numbers every waking moment now. And beneath all of it sat one impossible truth nobody wanted to say aloud. Ethan might never fully recover. Daniel closed the financial report slowly. "I loved that boy before any of you even knew his name," he said quietly. The conference room fell silent. "I taught him how to drive when he turned 15. I took him to his first Cubs game. I held him after his mother died." His jaw tightened briefly before he continued. "Do not mistake practicality for cruelty." No one answered him after that. Hours later, Daniel arrived at St. Gabriel Medical Center carrying revised legal documents for the board meeting, scheduled the following morning. The 5th floor remained unusually tense beneath quiet lighting and guarded hallways. As he stepped from the elevator, he noticed Margaret exiting room 511 carrying fresh linens. She looked exhausted, pale beneath fluorescent lights with dark circles under tired eyes. Daniel watched her silently for a moment before speaking. "Mrs. Collins." Margaret turned immediately. "Sir." Daniel glanced toward Ethan's room. "You spend considerable time with my nephew." Margaret gripped the linens slightly tighter. "I only do my job. My father seems convinced otherwise." His tone remained calm but less cold than before. More curious. Daniel studied her face carefully. "What exactly do you think is happening inside that room?" Margaret hesitated. "I do not know. But you believe he hears you." She looked toward the glass window quietly. Sometimes lonely people recognize each other even without words. Daniel seemed caught off guard by the answer. For several seconds he simply watched her silently. Then finally he asked, "Do you know what happens if Blackwood Holdings collapses?" Margaret blinked in surprise. "No, sir. Factories close. Thousands lose. Healthcare. Retirement accounts disappear." His voice remained steady but heavy now. "My father thinks protecting Ethan means freezing the entire company around his hospital bed forever." Margaret looked at him more carefully now. For the first time she noticed the exhaustion behind his perfect posture. "You think letting go is kinder?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "I think pretending hope exists where none may remain destroys everyone eventually." The words lingered heavily between them. Margaret lowered her eyes briefly before answering softly. "Maybe." Daniel looked toward room 511 again. "Then why does he only react when you are near?" Margaret had no answer for that, because honestly she barely understood it herself. Before either could continue, Olivia hurried down the hallway carrying a tablet. "Mr. Blackwood," she said nervously, "Dr. Hayes requested you immediately." Daniel nodded once before turning back toward Margaret. "Get some rest, Mrs. Collins." His voice softened slightly. "You look like the weight of the world is sitting on your shoulders." Then he walked away toward the conference room near the nurse's station. Margaret stood motionless for several moments afterward. Daniel was not the monster she expected. Tired. Complicated. Wrong perhaps. But not heartless. She returned quietly inside room 511 where Ethan lay beneath dim blue lighting while soft piano music drifted through the room again. Margaret sat beside him slowly. "Your uncle is scared," she whispered softly. "I think everybody in this family is." Ethan remained motionless at first. Then, very faintly, his fingers moved beneath hers again as snow continued falling silently beyond the hospital windows. The board meeting began at 7 o'clock the next morning, while freezing rain covered downtown Chicago in sheets of silver beneath dark winter skies. Inside Blackwood Holdings headquarters, executives filled a glass conference room overlooking the river, while financial reports scrolled across massive digital screens. But 40 blocks away inside St. Gabriel Medical Center, the real battle unfolded quietly behind closed doors on the 5th floor. Margaret Collins arrived carrying coffee in trembling hands after sleeping barely 2 hours. The hallway outside room 511 already felt different. Lawyers moved between private offices. Security guards stood beside elevators speaking into earpieces. Even the nurses looked tense. Olivia intercepted Margaret immediately near the nurses' station. "They are voting this morning," she whispered anxiously. "If the board sides with Daniel, they may push for long-term withdrawal recommendations." Margaret felt sick instantly. "Can they do that?" Olivia glanced toward the closed conference room nearby. "Legally? Maybe. Ethically? I do not know anymore." Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Hayes emerged from the hallway looking exhausted. He had clearly been awake all night reviewing medical charts and legal documentation. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "I need your help." Margaret nodded immediately. Dr. Hayes led her inside room 511 where Ethan rested beneath soft blue lighting, while snow mixed with freezing rain outside the windows. Several additional monitors now surrounded the bed recording neurological responses in real time. The outside specialists claim Ethan's reactions are inconsistent reflexes, Dr. Hayes explained while adjusting equipment. "I disagree." Margaret looked toward Ethan anxiously. "What can I do?" "Talk to him." She blinked in confusion. "That is all. That is what reaches him." Dr. Hayes lowered his voice further. "We are going to document every response live." Margaret slowly sat beside Ethan while Olivia activated monitoring software nearby. Her hands shook slightly from exhaustion and pressure filling the room. Somewhere across the city, powerful executives were deciding whether Ethan Blackwood's future still deserved investment. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered softly while taking his hand. "Looks like things are getting complicated again." Ethan remained still at first. Margaret swallowed hard before continuing. "Everybody keeps arguing about what your life is worth." Her voice trembled slightly now. "I think they forgot you can still hear them." A small spike appeared instantly across one monitor. Olivia looked toward Dr. Hayes sharply. Margaret continued speaking carefully. "Your grandfather has not given up on you." Another spike. Slightly higher this time. Dr. Hayes recorded the data silently. "Your uncle is scared," Margaret whispered. "Not because he hates you. Because he thinks everything is falling apart." Ethan's breathing shifted faintly beneath the blankets. The neurological readings climbed again. Olivia stared at the screen in disbelief. "This is impossible," she whispered. Then suddenly Ethan's eyelids trembled harder than ever before. Margaret leaned closer immediately. "Ethan." His fingers tightened weakly around hers again, while the monitors accelerated rapidly across the room. Dr. Hayes stepped closer carefully, barely breathing now. "Ethan," Margaret whispered softly through tears, "if you can hear me, keep fighting." A tear rolled slowly from the corner of Ethan's eye down his pale cheek. Olivia covered her mouth instantly. Dr. Hayes looked stunned. Margaret felt her own tears fall immediately afterward. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered shakily. "You are still in there." At that exact moment, the conference room door outside burst open. Daniel Blackwood entered alongside 2 neurologists and several attorneys carrying tablets and medical files. He stopped immediately after seeing the monitor activity. The room fell silent. One neurologist stepped forward quickly to review the screens. "What caused this spike?" Dr. Hayes answered calmly. "Emotional verbal stimulus." The specialist frowned while studying Ethan carefully. "His responses are significantly higher than previous reports." Daniel's eyes shifted slowly toward Margaret sitting beside the bed holding Ethan's hand. Again, he said quietly. Margaret looked up at him but said nothing. One of the attorneys stepped forward. The board requires updated prognosis estimates immediately. Dr. Hayes crossed his arms firmly. Then update them honestly. He pointed toward the screens. This patient demonstrates measurable neurological engagement under consistent external stimulation. Daniel remained silent while staring at Ethan's tear-streaked face. For the first time since Margaret met him, uncertainty crossed his expression openly. Not calculation. Not strategy. Fear. Because suddenly the possibility existed that Ethan might actually come back. And if he did, everything changed. Margaret looked back toward Ethan again while gently brushing tears from her own face. "You are not alone anymore," she whispered softly. Ethan's breathing steadied slightly beneath the blankets. Then, almost invisibly, his lips moved for the first time in 2 years. The sound barely escaped his throat. Weak. Broken. Almost impossible to hear. But everyone in the room heard it clearly enough. "Stay." Silence crashed over the room instantly. Olivia began crying softly beside the monitors. Dr. Hayes closed his eyes briefly in stunned relief. Daniel stared at Ethan in complete disbelief while the attorneys froze speechless behind him. And Margaret held Ethan's trembling hand tighter as tears rolled freely down her face while freezing rain battered the hospital windows beyond room 511. By sunrise, news of Ethan Blackwood's response had already spread quietly through every executive office connected to Blackwood Holdings. Nobody released statements publicly. No reporters gathered outside St. Gabriel Medical Center yet. But behind closed doors across Chicago, lawyers delayed contracts, shareholders postponed emergency filings, and board members suddenly stopped speaking about long-term withdrawal recommendations with the same confidence as before. Because one impossible truth now changed everything. Ethan Blackwood had spoken. Inside room 511, exhaustion hung heavily over everyone. Olivia slept briefly in the corner chair after crying through most of the night. Dr. Hayes remained buried in medical reports preparing documentation for both the hospital board and Blackwood attorneys. Meanwhile, Margaret Collins still sat beside Ethan's bed holding his hand gently, while pale winter sunlight slowly brightened the skyline outside the windows. Ethan had not spoken again since whispering that single word, but his neurological responses continued strengthening steadily throughout the morning. Margaret watched the slow rise and fall of his breathing while sipping cold coffee from a paper cup. "You caused quite a panic last night," she whispered softly. "I hope you know that." Ethan remained motionless beneath the blankets, though his fingers occasionally shifted weakly against hers now. Small movements, but real. Around 9 o'clock, Richard Blackwood entered the room quietly wearing the same suit from the previous day. His face looked older than ever, weighed down by sleeplessness and emotion. He clearly no longer cared to hide. He stopped beside Ethan's bed and stared silently at his grandson for several seconds before speaking. "When Ethan was 8 years old," Richard said softly, "he got lost during a charity gala at our summer estate in Maine." Margaret listened quietly while adjusting Ethan's blanket. Richard smiled faintly through tired eyes. "Security searched the property for nearly 2 hours. We thought he had wandered into the woods." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you know where we finally found him?" Margaret shook her head gently. "In the kitchen downstairs." Richard looked toward Ethan carefully. He was sitting beside one of the dishwashers helping her peel potatoes because she looked lonely. Silence settled softly around the room. "Even as a child," Richard whispered, "he noticed invisible people." Margaret felt tears sting her eyes unexpectedly. Richard turned toward her slowly afterward. "You saved my grandson." Margaret shook her head immediately. "No, sir. The doctors did that. Doctors kept him alive." Richard's voice softened deeply. "You gave him a reason to return." Before Margaret could answer, the room door opened again. Daniel Blackwood stepped inside carrying several folders beneath one arm. But this time something about him had changed. The polished corporate confidence seemed quieter now. Less certain. He approached Ethan's bedside slowly before speaking. "The board suspended all succession proceedings this morning." Richard looked at him carefully. "You agreed." Daniel nodded once. After last night, I could not justify continuing them. He glanced toward Ethan with conflicted emotion crossing his face. If there is even a chance he recovers, the company waits. Richard studied his son silently for several moments. Then finally he asked, "And if the company suffers because of it?" Daniel exhaled heavily. "Then we rebuild." The answer seemed to cost him something. Margaret watched both men carefully now. For the first time since entering this world of private hallways and billionaire families, she saw grief instead of power standing between them. Shared exhaustion. Shared fear. Daniel slowly approached the opposite side of Ethan's bed afterward. For several quiet seconds he simply looked at his nephew lying beneath soft blue light. Then finally he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You scared all of us, kid." Ethan's breathing shifted faintly again. Margaret noticed it immediately. Daniel did too. Emotion flashed briefly across his face before disappearing beneath controlled composure once more. "When you wake up," Daniel continued quietly, "you are going to find a complete mess waiting for you." A weak smile touched Richard's face for the first time in weeks. "That part runs in the family." Soft laughter filled the room briefly, fragile but genuine. Then suddenly Ethan's eyelids twitched harder than ever before. Margaret sat forward instantly. "Ethan." His breathing grew uneven again while monitors accelerated sharply beside the bed. Dr. Hayes looked up immediately from across the room and rushed closer. "Easy," he said calmly. "Do not overwhelm him." Ethan's fingers tightened around Margaret's hand once more while his eyelids struggled weakly beneath pale morning light. Everyone in the room fell silent. Slowly, painfully, Ethan's eyes opened halfway for the first time in 2 years. His vision looked unfocused, confused, frightened by the sudden flood of light and voices around him. Margaret leaned closer carefully while tears filled her eyes again. "It is okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "You are safe." Ethan's eyes moved weakly across the room before finally stopping on Margaret's face. For several long seconds he simply stared at her as though recognizing someone from far away. Then his cracked lips moved again very slowly. "You stayed," he whispered faintly. Margaret broke into tears immediately while Richard turned away, covering his mouth with trembling fingers. And outside room 511, beyond snow-covered streets and towering glass buildings, the city continued moving forward, completely unaware that behind one locked hospital door, a forgotten boy had finally found his way back. Rain hammered against the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center, while downtown Chicago disappeared beneath gray skies and blurred headlights. Inside room 511, Ethan Blackwood had not spoken again since whispering that single word the night before. But everything had changed anyway. Lawyers filled private offices on the 5th floor. Security guards doubled near the elevators. Nurses lowered their voices whenever members of the Blackwood family walked past. Because now nobody could pretend Ethan was completely gone anymore. Margaret Collins sat beside his bed beneath soft blue lighting while quiet piano music drifted through the room from the small speaker near the window. Ethan remained motionless beneath white blankets, but every few minutes his fingers shifted faintly against hers. Tiny movements. Weak movements. Yet real enough to make hope feel dangerous again. Margaret looked exhausted. She had barely slept after the emotional chaos of the previous night. Her eyes burned from fatigue while cold coffee sat untouched beside the bed. Still, she refused to leave him alone. "You really scared everybody," she whispered softly while adjusting the blanket near his shoulder. "Your grandfather looks like he aged 10 years overnight." Ethan's breathing changed slightly at the sound of her voice. Margaret noticed immediately now. So did the machines. Small neurological spikes appeared across the monitor screens every time she spoke directly to him. Around 8 that morning, Olivia entered the room carrying fresh patient charts. Her face looked tense. "Dr. Hayes needs you downstairs," she said quietly. Margaret frowned. "Is something wrong?" Olivia hesitated before answering. They found problems in Ethan's reports. Fear tightened instantly inside Margaret's chest. She followed Olivia through the silent hallway toward one of the private conference rooms near the nurses' station. Inside, Richard Blackwood stood beside the window staring down at the rain-covered streets below while several attorneys spread documents across a polished table. Daniel Blackwood sat at the far end of the room looking exhausted beneath his perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Dr. Hayes closed the door behind Margaret carefully before speaking. Over the last year, Ethan's neurological evaluations were edited before reaching the board. Margaret blinked in confusion. Edited how? One attorney slid 2 medical charts across the table. These are the original reports. Then he placed another stack beside them. And these are the versions submitted to Blackwood Holdings. Even Margaret could see the difference immediately. Entire sections had disappeared. Response patterns were reduced. Neurological improvements minimized. Richard's face darkened slowly while reading the pages. Someone intentionally buried signs of progress, he said coldly. Dr. Hayes nodded once. Certain administrators were pressured to simplify Ethan's long-term prognosis. Richard slowly turned toward Daniel. Did you know about this? Silence filled the room for several seconds. Rain struck the windows harder outside. Finally Daniel answered quietly. Not at first. Margaret watched Richard's expression change immediately. Hurt looked worse on powerful people because they spent most of their lives hiding it. Explain that answer carefully, Richard said. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaustion visible now beneath the polished executive image he normally carried so carefully. 6 months ago the board hired outside consultants to evaluate succession risks if Ethan never recovered. His eyes lowered briefly toward the reports. Some people wanted certainty for investors. So they manipulated medical information? Dr. Hayes asked sharply. Daniel exhaled heavily. Pressure was applied. And you allowed it, Richard said. This time Daniel did not deny it. Yes, he admitted quietly. The honesty stunned the room more than excuses would have. Margaret looked at him carefully now. For the first time she saw something beneath the corporate confidence. Not cruelty. Fear. The kind of fear that slowly convinced people survival mattered more than morality. Daniel rubbed tired eyes before continuing. Blackwood Holdings employs almost 40,000 people. Factories, shipping centers, retirement funds. Every quarter the uncertainty surrounding Ethan pushed the company closer toward instability. His voice softened slightly. I told myself I was protecting thousands of families. Richard stared at his son in silence. And somewhere along the way, he said bitterly, you forgot to protect your own. Nobody spoke after that because nobody inside the room could honestly disagree. Nearly an hour later Margaret returned quietly to room 511. Ethan remained asleep beneath dim lighting while rain continued sliding down the massive windows overlooking Chicago. She sat beside him again and gently took his hand. Families make terrible decisions when fear gets involved, she whispered softly. Ethan's fingers moved faintly beneath hers. The door opened quietly behind her moments later. Daniel stepped inside alone. No lawyers. No security guards. No board members. Just exhaustion. Margaret stood automatically. Sir. Daniel shook his head slightly. You do not need to do that anymore. He walked slowly toward Ethan's bedside while studying his nephew's pale face beneath the soft hospital light. When Ethan was 13, Daniel said quietly, he hacked my apartment security system because he thought changing every television channel to cartoons would be funny. A weak smile crossed his face briefly before disappearing again. He laughed about it for weeks. Margaret stayed silent. Daniel looked down at Ethan carefully. I kept telling myself there would be more time later. More dinners. More baseball games. More weekends. His voice lowered further. Then suddenly everything became business meetings and crisis management and lawyers. Rain echoed softly against the glass around them. Daniel swallowed hard before speaking again. I stopped seeing him as a boy. His eyes filled briefly with quiet regret. I started seeing him as a problem that needed solving. Margaret looked toward Ethan again while holding his hand gently between both of hers now. Fear changes people, she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, it does. He reached into his coat and removed a signed folder. This morning I suspended all withdrawal recommendations and succession actions indefinitely. Margaret looked stunned. You did. If Ethan is still fighting to come back, Daniel answered quietly, then the rest of us do not get to give up first. At that exact moment Ethan's fingers tightened weakly around Margaret's hand again, while the monitor beside the bed climbed slightly higher. Daniel stared at the movement silently. Emotion crossed his face for only a second before disappearing again beneath exhaustion. But Margaret saw it clearly anyway. Guilt, love, regret. The complicated grief of a man who realized too late that success meant nothing if it cost him his humanity. Daniel stepped slowly toward the door before stopping one final time. "My father said something to me earlier," he said quietly without turning around. Margaret waited silently. Daniel looked back toward Ethan beneath the dim blue light. "He said wealth built walls around this family for so long that eventually nobody inside knew how to reach each other anymore." Soft piano music drifted quietly through room 511 while rain continued falling across Chicago and Ethan's fingers remained wrapped weakly around Margaret's hand. Morning sunlight spilled faintly through the tall windows of room 511, while downtown Chicago slowly disappeared beneath melting snow and gray clouds. The hospital felt quieter than it had in months. Not peaceful exactly. More like the exhausted silence that followed a storm nobody knew how to survive. Ethan Blackwood had slept nearly 12 straight hours after the emotional collapse of the previous day. Dr. Hayes explained that neurological recovery often came in waves. The brain needed time to process stimulation after prolonged trauma. Still, every person walking into room 511 kept holding their breath whenever Ethan moved even slightly beneath the blankets. Margaret Collins sat beside his bed wearing the same pale blue sweater from the night before while a paper cup of untouched coffee cooled beside her chair. She looked exhausted enough to collapse herself. Yet she refused to leave. Around 8:15 that morning, Ethan's breathing suddenly changed again. Margaret immediately looked up from the paperback novel resting in her lap. His fingers twitched weakly against the blanket before his eyebrows tightened slightly, as though reacting to pain or confusion somewhere deep inside him. "Ethan," she whispered softly. His breathing grew uneven. "Faster now." Margaret leaned closer instantly while pressing the nurse call button beside the bed. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently. "You are okay. You are safe." Ethan's eyelids trembled hard beneath the pale hospital light. Then slowly, painfully, his eyes opened halfway again. This time they stayed open longer. Confused gray eyes moved weakly around the room while panic slowly appeared across his face. He looked disoriented, frightened, like someone waking inside a world that no longer made sense. The heart monitor accelerated sharply beside the bed. "Easy," Margaret whispered immediately while taking his hand carefully between both of hers. "Do not try to move." Ethan's chest rose unevenly beneath the blankets while his eyes darted toward the machines surrounding him. His throat worked painfully as though even breathing felt unfamiliar now. Dr. Hayes rushed into the room moments later alongside Olivia carrying monitoring equipment. "Good," the doctor said calmly while checking Ethan's neurological responses. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan looked toward the unfamiliar voice weakly but did not answer. Panic still flickered visibly across his face. Margaret stayed close beside him the entire time. "You are in St. Gabriel Medical Center," she whispered softly. "You were hurt, but you are safe now." Ethan's eyes slowly returned toward Margaret again. Something in his expression softened slightly whenever he focused on her voice. Dr. Hayes noticed immediately. "Do not overwhelm him," he warned quietly to the others inside the room. "His brain is processing too much information at once." Olivia adjusted one of the monitors while trying unsuccessfully not to cry. After nearly 2 years watching Ethan lie silent behind locked doors, seeing him awake felt almost unreal. Ethan swallowed painfully before trying to speak. No sound came out at first. Margaret moved closer immediately. "It is all right," she whispered gently. "You do not have to force anything." His breathing steadied slightly at her voice again. Then finally, in a weak broken whisper barely audible above the monitors, Ethan managed a single question. "What happened?" Margaret felt tears rise instantly into her eyes. The question sounded fragile, childlike almost. Not the voice of a billionaire heir surrounded by lawyers and corporate battles. Just a scared young man waking up alone after losing 2 years of his life. Dr. Hayes answered carefully. "You were in a serious accident, Ethan. Your recovery is going to take time." Ethan frowned faintly while trying to process the words. His eyes moved slowly around the room again before settling once more on Margaret's face. Confusion remained there. Fear too, but also recognition. Somewhere inside the darkness he remembered her voice. Richard Blackwood entered quietly a few moments later after Olivia called him upstairs. The older man froze the instant he saw Ethan awake. For several seconds he could not move at all. Ethan turned weakly toward him, still struggling to stay conscious beneath the overwhelming exhaustion pulling at him again. Richard's eyes filled immediately. "Hey kid," he whispered shakily. Ethan stared at him with visible confusion before recognition slowly appeared. "Grandpa." The word nearly destroyed Richard completely. He covered his mouth with trembling fingers while tears rolled freely down his face for the first time in front of anyone. Margaret quietly looked away to give him privacy, but the emotion inside the room felt impossible to escape. Ethan blinked slowly while trying to understand everything happening around him. "Why is everybody crying?" he whispered weakly. A soft laugh escaped Richard through tears. "Because you came back." Ethan looked overwhelmed by the answer. His breathing quickened again while fatigue visibly crashed over him. Dr. Hayes stepped forward calmly. "That is enough for now. His body cannot handle too much stimulation yet." Ethan's eyes began drifting closed again despite his effort to stay awake. Panic flashed across his face one final time before sleep pulled at him again. Margaret immediately squeezed his hand gently. "Hey," she whispered softly. "You are not disappearing this time. You are just resting." Ethan looked toward her weakly through heavy eyelids. For several quiet seconds he simply stared at her face as though anchoring himself to the sound of her voice. Then finally, with the last strength he had left, he whispered softly, "Where is Margaret?" Olivia broke into tears again beside the monitors while Richard lowered his head completely overcome with emotion. And Margaret sat frozen beside the hospital bed while Ethan's fingers weakly tightened around hers once more before exhaustion finally carried him back into sleep beneath the pale winter sunlight filling room 511. 3 weeks later, sunlight poured through the windows of St. Gabriel Medical Center for the first time in what felt like forever. Winter had finally begun loosening its grip on Chicago. Snow melted slowly along sidewalks while pale March sunlight reflected against the glass towers downtown. And on the 5th floor, the locked hallway no longer felt haunted. Room 511 stayed busy now. Physical therapists arrived every morning. Neurologists monitored Ethan Blackwood's speech and memory exercises throughout the afternoon. Nurses no longer whispered nervously outside his door because the impossible boy inside had become very real again. Recovery moved slowly exactly as Dr. Hayes predicted. Ethan could sit upright now for short periods, though exhaustion still hit him hard after simple conversations. His hands trembled sometimes while holding cups or turning book pages. Loud noises overwhelmed him easily. Certain memories remained blurry around the accident itself, but every single day he improved a little more. And every single day, the first person he looked for was Margaret Collins. That morning Margaret entered room 511 carrying fresh coffee and a paperback novel beneath one arm. Ethan sat near the window wearing a navy sweatshirt instead of hospital gowns for the first time. The sunlight across his face made him look younger somehow. Healthier. More human. He smiled faintly the moment he saw her. "You are late," he teased weakly. Margaret laughed softly while sitting down. "The coffee. You sound stronger every day. Dr. Hayes made me walk 30 feet this morning." Ethan grimaced dramatically. "I deserve compensation." "You are a billionaire," Margaret replied. "You already have compensation." Ethan smiled for a second before the expression faded slightly. "Not really." Margaret noticed immediately. Over the past weeks she had learned recovery was not only physical. Ethan woke into a world that had nearly moved on without him. Board meetings. Legal fights. Family betrayals whispered behind hospital doors. The emotional damage sat deeper than the machines ever measured. "Your uncle stopped by earlier," Margaret said carefully while adjusting the flowers near the window. Ethan looked surprised. "Daniel." She nodded. "He left before you woke up." Ethan stared quietly toward the skyline outside. "Is he still losing the company?" Margaret hesitated before answering. No, the truth was more complicated. Daniel Blackwood had stepped away from temporary succession control after Ethan regained consciousness. Several board members resigned following the investigation into manipulated medical reports. Investors panicked briefly once the scandal nearly reached financial media. But Richard Blackwood stabilized the company personally before permanent damage spread further. Yet Daniel was not destroyed afterward. No public humiliation. No dramatic downfall. Just consequences. Quiet ones. He lost authority, influence, trust, and somehow that seemed to hurt him more than money ever could. Later that afternoon, Daniel finally entered room 511 himself, carrying a small paper bag from Ethan's favorite sandwich place near Wrigley Field. He looked different now. Still polished. Still composed. But less armored somehow. Ethan watched him carefully while sitting upright beside the window. For several awkward seconds neither man spoke. Then Daniel held up the bag slightly. Turkey sandwich. Extra pickles. Ethan blinked in surprise. You remembered? Daniel gave a tired smile. Some things are harder to forget than others. Silence settled softly through the room. Finally Ethan spoke quietly. Everybody keeps acting weird around me. Daniel exhaled slowly, before pulling a chair closer. That is because people are scared when they almost lose someone. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Were you scared? The question landed heavily between them. Daniel looked toward the hospital windows for several seconds before answering honestly. Terrified. Ethan studied his uncle carefully now. Margaret said you were trying to protect the company. Daniel nodded once. I thought if I controlled the situation tightly enough, nobody else would suffer. His voice softened with regret. But fear makes people do cold things while convincing themselves they are being practical. Ethan remained quiet after that. Then finally he asked the question nobody else dared speak aloud. Did you think I was never coming back? Daniel's eyes lowered briefly. Yes. The honesty hurt, but it also healed something inside the room because for once nobody was hiding behind polished words anymore. Ethan leaned back slowly against the chair cushions while exhaustion flickered across his face again. Recovery still drained him quickly. Daniel noticed immediately and stood. Get some rest, kid. Before leaving, he stopped near the doorway and looked back one final time. I am sorry. Ethan said nothing at first. Then quietly, almost too softly to hear, he answered. I know. That evening Richard Blackwood arrived carrying legal paperwork and a check large enough to change Margaret's entire life. This will cover your mother's treatment, he said gently. And anything else you may ever need. Margaret stared at the number in stunned silence before slowly pushing the check back across the table. I cannot accept this. Richard looked genuinely confused. Why? Margaret glanced through the glass toward Ethan laughing weakly with Olivia inside room 511. Because I did not stay for money. Richard's eyes filled quietly with emotion again. Then what do you want? Margaret smiled softly after several seconds of silence. Peace would be nice. 2 days later, for the first time in nearly 2 years, the heavy doors of room 511 remained fully open throughout the afternoon. Sunlight poured across the polished hospital floor while piano music drifted softly. Through the hallway once hidden behind security codes and whispered rumors, nurses walked freely in and out carrying flowers and paperwork. Olivia laughed with Ethan near the windows while Dr. Hayes reviewed physical therapy schedules nearby. And Margaret Collins stood quietly at the doorway watching all of it with tired eyes and peaceful relief settling finally into her chest. Richard stopped beside her silently for a moment before speaking. Funny thing about closed doors, he said softly. Margaret looked toward him. Richard smiled faintly while sunlight filled the once forbidden room behind them. Sometimes the person keeping hope alive is the one nobody notices walking through them every night.